You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Become a subscriber and support Radical Radio. Call 03 9419 8377 or subscribe online at 3cr.org.au/subscribe.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live, that's right, on 3cr.org.au, courtesy of the Community Radio Network, as I mentioned before. It's heard all across Australia on a number of community radio stations. So welcome to the Anarchist World This Week. And if you're wondering what you're listening to, you know, anarchos without rulers. Anarchism is about creating a society without rulers. What determines the lives of billions of people? Obviously, inequalities in power and wealth. And in 2025, we're seeing that transition to powerful people using the state apparatus to bring their wet dreams to life. So if there was one period in human history where we needed anarchists, people who are involved in the struggle to share power through direct democratic means, and people involved in the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good, it's 2025. Now, obviously, you respect a budget response, as the budget was delivered last night by the Federal Treasurer, Mr. Chalmers. And I'm going to throw a few little ideas around. I've already noticed the naysayers carrying on about this and that, and, you know, the Minister for Hate, Mr. Dutton, rubbing his hands saying, we'll give you more tax cuts, and the list goes on and on. Now, the issue is, now obviously, the Labor Party did what it could, all right? We live in a society where wealth is not held in common. We live in a society where real power doesn't lie in Parliament. That's the reality. The reality is we live in a society where we rely on the crumbs brushed off the corporate table to survive. Now, living within that framework, governments are constrained in what they're able to deliver. So you deliver a little bit here, a little bit there. And obviously any reform which improves people's lives is welcome. So if you've got a chronic illness and the cost for essential medications drops, that's a positive. If you have medical issues and it's easier to access bulk billing services in the private sector or access to treatment in public hospital, that's a positive. And if you're a gig worker on these horrible little contracts, and when you sign your contract, you don't notice that when you go to work for somebody else, you won't be allowed to. And that stricture is removed for people who earn less than $175,000 a year. That's a good thing. So I'm not here. And if you get a minuscule tax cut, it all helps. Or an energy rebate as far as your electricity bill is concerned. So I'm not particularly critical about any of that. Now, obviously, we have two types of governments in this country which are vying, not two types of government, two types of ideologies which are vying for political ascendancy over the next few weeks. Right? You've got political parties and their hanger-oners who are all about promoting the idea that the way to improve people's lives is to give the private sector its head. Remove regulations, remove any chance of any major competition, allow corporations to get bigger, and the list goes on and on. And we all know what political parties support that. Then you have, on the other side, you have political parties and their mates who are about ensuring, right, that a few more crumbs are brushed off the corporate table, okay? But ultimately, in the Australian political system, which is a representative democracy, power does not lie in Parliament. If power lay in Parliament, you would think that many of the issues which people face on a day-to-day basis would have been resolved decades ago. Now, I know this may sound a bit boring, but when you see advertisements around the place where private charities are raising money to send Australian kids to public schools, you realise there is something very, very wrong. Or when you're referred to a public hospital and you're told you go on a waiting list for an appointment, and if you're lucky, you'll obtain an appointment in 3 years' time for not a critical condition, but a condition which is causing you issues which can't be resolved in the private sector, then you know you've got issues. And that's the dilemma when we, as a people, continue to believe that the only way forward is to get some more crumbs brushed off the corporate table, believing that the only way forward is for a private investment, for private profit, mantra. So the budget does what it can in a difficult situation. But if we continue to rely on supporting the system and not raising alternatives within the community, then we will get more of the same. Now, I don't know if you know this. Well, you know the concept of manna. When I think the Israelites crossed into Israel and there was no food, God or heaven, let's not involve God in this conversation, but heaven provided this glossy thing on the trees which kept people going. Manna, it was called. And we all know the term manna from heaven. This is an Old Testament, story. All right? Whether you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew, you're all into the Old Testament, all right? So manna from heaven, okay? Now, those of you who are a little bit familiar with our natural environment would have heard the word Manna under the wattle. So where am I going? Am I lost? Am I lost? Where am I going? Well, in southwest Australia, on Noongar territory, traditional owners, manna gums play an important role in providing seeds and gum which is used for food and medicine. So people talk about manna under the gums, right? Makes simple sense. But I thought I'd extend this a little bit further and actually tie this in with the budget. Now, hang in there. I'm sure you're wondering where I'm going. Where's this crazy idiot going? Now, I think we need to look a bit further and talk about manna beneath the wattle. Not manna that's dropped off the wattle, the seeds and the gum which is produced on the bark, but manna beneath the wattle. And I want to talk about the manna diggers in this country. Now, if there is one place on this God-forsaken planet where people should not be concerned about accessing the basic necessities of life, and I'm just talking about physical necessities, let alone psychological necessities, it is Australia, the continent of Australia. We have a miserable 26.5, possibly 27 million people living on our continent. This is an extraordinarily resource-rich continent. This is the manna beneath the wattle. All those resources around the country beneath the wattle. Extraordinary riches. Extraordinary. Irrespective of what you think, of a coal-driven economy, the fact is there is manna under them there hills, as they say. So what do we do as a country? What do we do? What do we allow to happen as a people? That's you and me, you and me. What do we do? We allow governments, which we elect, to turn over, to give away this manna to the manna diggers, who are basically large transnational and national-based corporations, to dig up this wealth and export it and hold on to the majority of the profits which can be made from this manna. Think about it. Who else, who in their right mind would allow their people to suffer, or some of their people to suffer, in order to enrich people who are already more than wealthy enough? It's totally crazy. So when you look at a budget, you've got to balance income and outgoings, right? It's simple. Income, outgoings. Now, if you live in a country where you allow the manna beneath the wattle to be dug up by a third party and used by that third party to enrich themselves at the expense of the majority of people in this country, you have to have rocks in your head. And that's what we do. Year after year after year after year. We have forgotten that we live in the Commonwealth of Australia, where that manna beneath the wattle can play such a critical role in the lives of all of us. First Nations people who are rich, who own the wealth, the rest of us who've turned up over the centuries. There's more than enough to go around. But what we do as a people, what we do as a nation, we say, oh, let somebody else develop it. And when they develop it, we will get a little bit of royalty, a few jobs, some taxes, and we're happy with that. Ridiculous. Totally ridiculous. So if you are unhappy with the budget, if you're thinking of voting for the Minister of Hate and his cohorts, if you think the Labor Party and the Greens are basically, brushing crumbs off the corporate table, well, you're right. And why does that happen? And that happens is because we as a people have allowed it to happen. We think that the way forward is to get a third party to profit from the manna beneath the wattle in this country. It's an extraordinary situation to find ourselves in 2025. Extraordinary situation. I mean, the fundamental issue in this country, irrespective of what socially progressive issues people face or try to do something about, but the fundamental issue is an ingrained economic inequality which creates entrenched economic privilege, which creates social dislocation, unnecessary suffering, and violence in the community. That's the fundamental issue. It doesn't matter how you try to shuffle the cards during budget time if you don't have access to the manna beneath the wattle and use the profits that are made from exploiting the manna beneath the wattle, then we will get more of the same, irrespective of what happens at the federal election in the next few weeks. Think about it. Would any intelligent person allow this to happen? I'll give you another example. Another simple example. The thing is, everybody says economics is hard. It's not. It's bloody simple. All right? It's simple. I'll give you another example. You got a backyard. You're lucky enough to have a backyard, which is a shrinking commodity in 2025. You fall over a rock, and that rock is a 20-kilo gold nugget, right? A 20-kilo gold nugget, and you got a bad back. And it's a 20-kilo gold nugget, and let's not forget that gold is now over about 4,500 Australian dollars per ounce. Remember when a treasurer sold the Australian gold reserves at $200 an ounce? But that's a different story. I won't mention the gentleman's name. He's got a brother who's involved in the anti-gambling campaigns. That's all I'll tell you. So you got a bad back and you haven't got any friends you can trust. So you go on the net, you find somebody who's willing to remove that gold from your backyard for 95% of the cost of the gold, all right? You get 5%, they get 95%. Now, who in their right mind would agree to that? Obviously, no one. But we as a people, we as a nation state, a sovereign nation state, we're quite happy to hand over the manna beneath the wattle for a 5% return. Extraordinary. You listen to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name is Joseph Toscano. So, if you're unhappy with the budget, if you think it should have gone further, think about the fundamental reasons why we cannot seem to solve the simplest economic issues in this country. Let's move on. Gaza. The carnage accelerates. The world sits on its hands. Look, sometimes in life you feel totally powerless, but it's not a matter of being powerless. It's a matter of, striking back. Whether it's through words or actions, is a debatable point. But people keep talking about the war in Gaza. Now, I can understand about people talking about the war in the Ukraine, where you've got two parties. They've got a lot of, weapons of destruction fighting each other. And obviously people die. That's the nature of war. But almost 18 months since October 2023, we are seeing the collective punishment of over 2 million people who currently face this prospect of mass deportation. Let's look at the facts. I know facts are not very popular in 2025. We tend to make them up as we go, don't we? We change the historical record. We don't like something, we kind of ignore it. Or if we don't really like it, we make up alternative facts. You like that? Alternative facts. As if there could be alternative facts. Now, let's look at the carnage. Now, Gaza is about half the size of Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane, okay? It has been the world's largest prison for the last 16 years since Hamas took political control. Okay? Fact. The Israeli state, through its Western backers, especially the United States of America, has done everything possible in order to ensure that the Palestinians' right to a homeland is thwarted. Over the last almost 18 months, we've seen 50,000 Palestinians in Gaza. 50,000. 70% women and children being blown to bits. Another 10 to 11,000 are missing. Authorities assume they're under the rubble somewhere. 90% of Gaza has been reduced to rubble. Hospitals, journalists, tent cities, mosques, churches, even the Australian War Cemetery in Gaza. Let's not forget that Australians died in World War I and are buried in the Commonwealth War Cemetery in Gaza. We don't hear much about that these days, do we? How it's been defiled by the Israeli forces. But the carnage accelerates and we shrug our shoulders. We think, well, maybe they deserve it. And then we bend over backwards to support war criminals. I never cease to be amazed by the garbage which is spewed forth by the privately owned media, social media, and also legacy media and the government-gilded ABC regarding the Gaza carnage. People talk about a war, right? One side has got tanks and planes and ships and 2,000-kilo bombs and drones. And the other side's got a few guns and a few rockets. Is that a war? And then we see war criminals, people who've got a little, if they leave Israel and go to a state which actually is part of the International Criminal Commission, accepts its jurisdiction, they'd be finding themselves in front of the War Tribunal or the court in The Hague in the Netherlands. But we bend over backwards to justify what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank. We bend over backwards. Our political leaders bend over backwards. Our social commentators bend over backwards. So that the conversation in the streets is about how difficult life is for Israelis. While there seems to be minimal sympathy for a people who are undergoing brutality that has not been seen in the 21st century on this planet. Now, could you imagine if the Russians were doing the same thing in Kiev, where they stopped food, electricity, water from entering Kiev? Could you imagine the outcry? And it'd be justified. But why is the same outcry justified in Gaza? Are Palestinians human beings? Are they some type of, alien life form that's come to Earth from outer space? It's all very well talking about the fact that the Israelis, who were expelled by the Romans 2,000 years ago, have the right to a homeland. But when you think about it, who was responsible for the Holocaust? Was it the Palestinians? Or was it Europe? Or was it the Europeans? Who was responsible for the Holocaust? Who set up the death camps? Who rounded up Jews from around Europe? Who invented an industrial way of extermination? Men, women and children. Was it the Palestinians? So why are the Palestinians being asked to pay the price for the Holocaust? It's escaped me. Maybe it's God's will. So think about it. Talk to your neighbours. Don't avert your eyes, because that's the problem. Things are so disgusting. The atrocities are so huge that as a human being, we tend to avert our eyes. We tend to keep our thoughts to ourselves. Well, it's time you didn't keep your thoughts to yourselves, because it's when you bring this up in conversation with other people that change becomes possible. You're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. And just in case you've missed a few words, well, the program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. Turkey. Textbook Road to Dictatorship. Isn't it interesting how parliamentary democracies can be so easily subverted? And the issue about Bufalini being president of the US of A is not an issue about his policies and the policies which are being pushed by the Republican Party, but it's the issue of the centralisation of power in the hands of fewer and fewer people, who then can use that power to make their wet dreams a reality. That's the central issue. Although the American Democrats attempted to make it an issue, people were so disgusted with the situation they found themselves in. They felt that a billionaire who doesn't pay tax could help them. It's a little bit like us giving somebody else the right to profit from the manna beneath the wattle. So in Turkey, or Turkey, we've noticed over the last 2 decades the move from a representative democracy to dictatorship. And the last little step has been taken to ensure that the current president becomes dictator for life. Where if you feel there's an opposition figure who may be able to unthrone you at the next presidential election, what do? You put the opposition figure in jail. You arrest his supporters. You attempt to ensure, like Mr. Putin does, that when the next election rolls round, there's only one candidate. And that's what we've seen in Turkey. But the problem for Europe is that Turkey has become a fundamental peg in their resistance to the Russians. So what we see happening in Gaza and the West Bank becomes acceptable. So what we see in Turkey with mass arrests, acceptable. And that's the dilemma. Now, if you think that somehow things are different in this country, think again. Because ultimately, our constitutional framework does not protect the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power. What that means is you don't have any fundamental constitutional rights which a court can actually use to derail a government's ability to entrench itself for life. Although we don't have a presidential system where power tends to gravitate to one individual, we do have a system where Parliament has extraordinary powers. Not extraordinary powers in terms of determining economics, but extraordinary powers in determining the activities of the individual and the individual working collectively in this country. These powers are so extraordinary that the High Court of Australia had to find there was an implied right to freedom of speech in this country, which only applies during election campaigns. Because if you've got no freedom of speech, you can't have an election, can you? Or you can't have an election campaign. You can't have an election with one party winning over and over again. So what we see in the United States of America is the same road that has been travelled by the Turkish president, where the courts become part and parcel of the state. The courts then become dependent on the leadership of that state. The courts are then used to disenfranchise citizens, as we see in Turkey. And what we see in the United States of America, and I'm not even talking about policies that will lead to the death of 6 million people from AIDS because they've withdrawn aid here, and policies that will lead to the death of hundreds of thousands of children because they've taken the last grain of rice from their mouth. I mean, you'd expect that. But I'm talking about the use of executive presidential powers to ignore court rulings, and more importantly, the use of presidential executive power or orders to actually crush opposition. Whether it's opposition in terms of allowing certain legacy media into briefings at the White House because they don't support the government's agenda, or actually outlawing a legal firm because of the position it's taken. So what we see is the introduction of regulations and rules which try to destroy any opposition. And that's the dilemma. And that's the dilemma that we face in this country with the forthcoming federal election. Now, the accidental buffoon, that's right, Mr. Dutton, is a classical example of the leader of a political party whose primary interest is to ensure that we continue to fight amongst ourselves about the crumbs which are brushed off the corporate table. Now, it's an extraordinary situation we find ourselves in 2025, where we see the rise and rise and rise of the centralisation of authority. See, and that's what anarchism has always been about. It's been about breaking down the power which can be wielded by a minuscule minority, or in some cases, an individual. And some of the most atrocious things that have happened in world history have happened not because there's deinstitutionalisation and decentralisation of power, but because power has been held by an individual or a small clique who believe their interests are the only things that are relevant in society and are happy to do anything necessary to ensure they maintain power. And that's the dilemma we face as a people with the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. They think it's their God-given right to exploit us. And what we've seen over the last 50 years is a classical example of what happens when government gets out of the way of business in a private investment for private profit world. Now, you know, we talk about on this program childcare, aged care, health care, education, infrastructure, and the world goes on. And we talk about the manna beneath the wattle and how to handle this heavenly gift. And what we see is a greater concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands, and more importantly, a greater concentration of power in fewer and fewer hands, where those who have the wealth now have the power to determine parliamentary legislation. Not in terms of patting somebody on the shoulder and saying, this is what we want in Parliament, but in terms of manipulating the system to such a degree that any political party that finds itself in power, especially those that challenge the status quo, finds they're limited in what they can do. And this federal election campaign and the response to the budget is a classical way in which to create fear, uncertainty, division, hatred within the community, so that votes flow to the very people who create that division, who fan that hatred, who think facts are disposable commodities. So in an era where we are seeing more intense climate variations in this country than we've seen in the past, obviously there's always been a land of flooding, plains and whatever, but the fact is that this is ignored. It's not a fact. It's not a fact. Facts are no longer facts. And we have a whole range of privately owned entities, virtual platforms, which pander to these myths. So, what can you do about it? Look, I can pontificate till the world comes to an end, but it's not going to make much difference. Obviously, thoughts, words are important. And words lead to action. But words which don't lead to action don't really achieve much. And that's the dilemma. A democracy isn't rule of the people, by the people, for the people. It's rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public. And that's the key ingredient that's missed in Australian life, an engaged public. We have so many diversions at our fingertips as a people. Although 1/3 of the population lives a day-to-day existence, we don't have mass starvation. Although only 1/3 of the population owns their home, 1/3 is paying it off, another third is paying rent, we don't have mass homelessness. Although, interestingly, we are seeing increasing levels of anxiety, especially anxiety amongst younger Australians about their future in a world that's dominated by private investment for private profit mentality. So, what can you do? What can you do? What can you do? Well, you can take up a new hobby. Collect 50-cent coins. Go to the football if you can afford it every weekend. What else could you do? Become a food connoisseur if you got the money. Take lots of holidays if you got the money. Because, see, the fascinating thing about living in a capitalist society is the amount of freedom you have as an individual is not something which is constitutionally protected. It depends on the amount of disposable income you have. The more disposable income you have, the more freedom you have from wage slavery, the more options you have. And that's what money is in a capitalist society. It is the vehicle to give the individual options. And not a lot of Australians have options. Maybe they'll do one holiday a year. 1/3 live on social security benefits. Minimal options. Another third are paying off their home. Minimal options. It's a lifetime, burden. Pay off your home. Then you've got self-funded retirees, people of my age, who I feel sorry for, whose whole future is determined by the gyrations of their superannuation fund. Very sad, where we have to pay for our own old age after working for decades and paying taxes for decades. That's the reward you get. You're allowed to put your money in the capitalist system to generate a profit to keep you out of a nursing home. It's very funny. So what can you do? All right. Well, you can, as I said, you can take up a hobby. While you can afford it, you can write to the Prime Minister. You can cry. I'd cry every morning when I wake up, when I think of what's in front of us as a people. You can despair and become cynical. And everything everybody raises, is terrible. It's not going to get anywhere. Why bother fighting City Hall? You can never win. You realise cynicism is the aphrodisiac of those who exercise power and acquire wealth. While you're cynical, you may be very funny, but the fact is your cynicism feeds them, increases their power. You can make fun of them. Buffalini, the accidental buffoon. The list goes on and on. Makes you feel good, but unless it's taken up by millions of people, it's pretty ineffective. You can participate in parliamentary elections. I'm currently in the process of running a Toscano for Flinders campaign. Why am I doing this? Do I think I'll be elected? Of course not. I've got a snowflake's chance in hell of being elected. I'm a realist. But what I like to do is create a bit of uncertainty in a blue ribbon Liberal seat, which is Flinders. Now, whether I get across the line or not in terms of nominations or not, I'll find out in the next week or so. But the thing is, I'm doing something, okay? It may be a drop in the ocean, but I'm trying to do something. And if we all tried to do something, maybe the trajectory this country has been on for the last half a century would shift. Would shift in the direction of the people of this country, would shift in the directions of First Nations people and the rest of us in this country, not continue to shift in the direction of large, unaccountable corporations. I mean, what a life we live in the land of so-called Manna beneath the wattle. And we have to fight amongst ourselves to catch the crumbs which are brushed off the corporate table in our direction every time we kind of make a bit of a murmur. That's the other thing. Who do we blame? See, the blame game is very effective for the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. I'll give you a simple blame game, right? Now, legislation was changed in this country to make it very easy for people to come into this country, right? It was changed for one reason only. Well, two reasons. One is to create a Ponzi type of economic scheme where the more people you have, the more you produce, blah, blah, blah. But the other thing it was introduced for was to put downward pressure on wages and break the bargaining power that trade unions were able to exercise in this country in the 1970s and the early 1980s. So instead of blaming government legislation and political ideologies and political parties which allowed this to occur, it's much easier when you find you don't have a job because you don't have a lot of skills and you left school early and those jobs are disappearing. It's much easier to blame the other instead of looking at the system as a whole, because nobody looks at the system as a whole. I mean, if 1 + 1 = 2. If you do something, there'll be a reaction. And if you react against the reaction, not what happened, well, you're not going to get anywhere. And that's the situation we find ourselves in. All right, let's move on. Now, if you do live in the electorate of Flinders, two dates I'd like you to remind you of. One is Wednesday the 26th of March, where we'll be meeting at La Porchetta's in Frankston for the monthly Pieacemeal dinner. All welcome. And on Friday, That'll be the 28th of March. I'll be holding a meeting in the upstairs room at the Rosebud Hotel beginning at 7:30 p.m. to see whether we jump over the parapets, whether we have the nominations to jump over the parapets and get involved in the Flinders federal election campaign. So if you do live in that area and you're interested in the campaign, come along. We'll be doing a little talk and then taking nominations. So let's see how we go with that. I'd also like to remind you that atrocities are not just happening in Gaza, happening 70 kilometres from the Australian mainland in West Papua. And this Sunday, that's the 30th, that's this Sunday the 30th of March at 1 p.m, the West Papuan Rent Collective and supporters will be gathering at the West Papuan office, which is funded by the West Papuan Rent Collective. People like you and me putting in $1 a day in order to pay their rent so they can conduct their political struggle in the way they see fit. And 3 times a year we have a gathering. You're all welcome. Lunch at 1 p.m, presentation 2 p.m, and then we do an auction at 3 p.m. to raise some extra money for the Rent Collective. So that's this Sunday, 30th of March, 1 p.m, and the address is 838 Collins Street, Docklands. 838 Collins Street, Docklands. And last but not least, I'd like to look at something that you may find interesting, you may find boring. Now, have you ever thought of the interaction between nature, goodwill, and artificial intelligence? Well, I hadn't. But I've been thinking about it recently and I've been, looking into this. You see, nature doesn't care. It doesn't care about you. There's no goodwill. You step on a snake, there's a good chance it'll bite you. You annoy a crocodile, there's a good chance you could become its dinner. You go surfing, there's a little chance that you may find yourself becoming shark bait. See, nature just plugs on. No goodwill towards the human race. Considering what the human race has done to nature, you'd think that it would strike back. I mean, the old concept of Gaia. But, no goodwill towards human beings, okay? Now let's look at artificial intelligence. Does artificial intelligence have any goodwill to the human race? Can you actually incorporate the concept of goodwill into artificial intelligence? And the fact is, no. So in many regards, by accepting unreservedly artificial intelligence within our human framework, we set ourselves up for a fall. Because nature does not extend goodwill to the human race, and neither does artificial intelligence. Think about it. Bit esoteric, but as we move forward, it's something that we need to think about. Because goodwill is what keeps us together as human beings. It's that goodwill we show to each other, something which seems to be lacking in so many parts of the world. You've been listening to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. 3 things to remember. Tonight, March the 26th, 6:30 p.m, public interest before corporate interest dinner down at La Porquetas in Frankston. Starts at 6:30 p.m, you're all welcome. Friday the 28th of March, 7:30 p.m, Rosebud Hotel, meeting room upstairs. Important meeting regarding the future of the Toscano for Flinders campaign. Do we jump over the parapet or not? If you're in the Flinders electorate, come along this Friday. And don't forget Sunday, the West Papuan Rent Collective gathering, 838 Collins Street, Docklands. Walk around to the back where all the people are, meet the West Papuan activists, become a member of the West Papuan Collective. That's 1 p.m, Sunday, the 30th of March. Thank you once again for listening to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. My name is Joseph Toscano, and listen in to the Anarchist World This Week. Next week, leave a message on 0439 395 489. Here we go. We're about to go. The sacred cows have wandered off. They're going to lunch. Lucky little cows. Hopefully they don't get slaughtered for their meat.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
.3CR is about community, and we welcome your participation at the station.
3CR is open to a wide diversity of volunteers and is a great way to connect with Melbourne's activist community.
Have you ever thought about volunteering, doing a reception shift, getting a program on air?
Training in radio skills or contributing to one of the station's committees.
There are many ways to be involved at 3CR.
To find out more, go to 3cr.org.au and get in touch.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.